gospel lesson today will be Jeremiah 1:4-10. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Ah, Lord God, truly I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy. But the Lord said to me, Do not say I am only a boy, for you shall go to all to whom I send you, and you all shall speak whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Now I have to put my words in your mouth. See, today I appointed you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Okay, our gospel lesson will be Luke 13:10-17. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had been crippled for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, Woman, you are set free from your ailment. When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days to be cured, and not on the Sabbath day. But the Lord answered him and said, You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath unite his ox or donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day? When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing.
Would you pray with me? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Well, today's gospel lesson that Sophie just read is a simple miracle story. A woman who was crippled for 18 years and was healed by Jesus. She was bent over because of an unclean spirit, and Jesus alleviated the problem, and so be it. For the first time in 18 years, she's able to stand up again. She was healed, the crowd rejoiced, thrilled with the new life this woman was able to celebrate. Seems easy to understand, right? But there are many more complications present in this story. To the woman who is healed, this is more than just a simple chapter in the gospel. It changed her life forever. To the people who witnessed the healing, this was a revelation of God's presence in their midst, and perhaps their faith was strengthened in that moment. To the leader of the synagogue, this was blasphemy. Their laws clearly prohibited this sort of behavior. Forget about God's grace, the law is the law. To the leader of the synagogue, this miracle should not have been allowed on the Sabbath day. Think about it for a moment. What it would have been like for this woman. 18 years she suffered. She was quite unable to stand up straight, it says in our translation, making many tasks difficult or impossible. She couldn't look a person in the eye even when she was speaking to them. There were no handicapped ramps or restrooms or concessions that we have in our context. Her crippling disease was not only a physical ailment, it was also an emotional burden. Because of this ailment, she was probably ostracized by her community. Because of this ailment, she lost her dignity, her very sense of self-worth. The author of the Gospel of Luke tells us that her condition was caused by a spirit. That meant her community had labeled her. Her unclean status was how her community would have labeled her, and this unclean status would have kept her from enjoying the privileges of those who are considered proper, and would have made her a pariah to other worshipers in the synagogue. Not that she would have been mistreated necessarily. She would have been allowed to express her faith in the synagogue in a limited way. She would have been tolerated, but because of who she was, she would not have been lifted up and affirmed as a beloved child of God. But despite all of that, she did not lose her faith. We can infer this because despite the difficulties caused by her condition, she still made it to the synagogue. And she was in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. If we understand the context in which this was written, it's appropriate to assume that the author of this gospel is trying to imply that because she was in the synagogue on the Sabbath day, she was a faithful Jewish woman, despite this crippling ailment she had. She did not allow this to drive her away from her faith. So on this day, the bent-over woman came to the synagogue, not because she wanted to get something, not because she expected to be healed, not because she heard that Jesus would be there that day and he was going around the Galilean countryside healing bent-over women. She went to the synagogue because her faith was strong and she desired to express the faith that was her tradition. Her tradition. Now there's a loaded word, right? Tradition can be a burden or it can be a strength. This year, we're talking a lot about tradition here at Columbia United Church of Christ as we prepare for the 50th anniversary of this building, our presence here on this site. As we talk about tradition, I have heard many stories of our traditions. The decision to move from downtown, the agony over that decision, the construction of this facility, and the traditions that have taken place since we've been here. I've heard about a church that planted in this place has grown and developed wonderful traditions that feed our faith and enhance our spiritual life that are different than the traditions that the chapel would have even imagined. Our traditions have given us a source of strength and a source of hope. But tradition can also bind a person to things which are not healthy. Many people act solely out of tradition without contemplating the reasons why they are acting that way. I've known people affiliated with political parties, both of them, who continue to vote their party because that's how their parents voted, and that's how their grandparents voted, and that's how they always voted. Their own values might not align with the particular party platform, but that's irrelevant because it's tradition. The fact that neither party is the same as it was in their grandparents' or great-grandparents' day was also irrelevant because it's still tradition. Perhaps you've heard the story of the woman making ham. One day a woman was in the kitchen preparing a ham for cooking and she cut the end off the ham and put it aside before putting it in her roasting pan. Her son is watching her cook and asked her why she always cuts the end off the ham. And she replied, "Well, that's the way my mother always used to do it." The next time they visited Grandma, the boy was in the kitchen watching her cook, and he asked Grandma, "Why do you always cut the end off the ham before putting it in the roasting pan?" And she replied, "Well, that's what my mother always used to do." Well, Sunday came, and after church, the family went over to visit great-grandma in the nursing home. The boy asked her, "Great-grandma, why did you always cut the end off of a ham before putting it in your roasting pan?" To which great-grandma replied, "Because my darn roasting pan was too small." Tradition can bind us into situations such as that or more serious situations of injustice. Today, religious tradition bound this woman to a situation where her dignity, her identity, and her very sense of self-worth was stripped away. She was considered to be a lesser human being because of the rules of religion of the day. But as we know, the rules didn't matter to Jesus. Jesus was one of the greatest rule breakers of all time. Jesus broke the rules of man to promote the will of God when he recognized those rules were arbitrary and unfair, hurting others instead of healing them. Laws should bring relief and order to the people, not diminish the masses because of tradition, fear, or power struggles among the elite. Jesus recognized this and spoke up against the unfair rules in his day and age. And sometimes he spoke up by ignoring them. And that's what he did today in our gospel reading. As Jesus is teaching in the synagogue on that Sabbath day, he notices this bent-over woman. She doesn't approach Jesus and beg him to be healed. Approaching Jesus is the last thing an unclean woman with no dignity would have done. As an unclean woman, she wasn't allowed to even speak to a rabbi, such as Jesus. But he saw her, and he approached her, and he reached his hands out to her, and touched her, and blessed her, affirmed her for the person she was, the person of worth and dignity. Blessing and affirming her, she began to rise. Slowly her gaze moved up from the little section of floor that she had been accustomed to looking at for 18 years, up, until she met Jesus' eyes. Here she was, gazing up into the eyes of her Savior. This sense of restoration is part of what yesterday was about at the Columbia Pride Fest. Now, I'm not saying ailment. I want to make that clear. But this sense of disenfranchisement that many in our community have felt because of the capricious laws and traditions of white, cisgender male lawmaking have told people that they are less than worthy because of how they were created. But Pride Fest was a time of healing for many in that community, as well as a display of support for allies. But it's also a time when churches such as Columbia United Church of Christ and others can exemplify Jesus' healing love by making a bold and prophetic statement that all of God's children are loved, despite the derogatory claims of many in the ecclesial community over the past 150 years or so of gay bashing and hate mongering. In doing so, churches in our community are supporting the healing ministry of Jesus, attempting to heal the wounds that have been inflicted by others and restoring life to God's hurting children, just as Jesus restored life to the bent-over woman. I was thrilled to see that there were several churches with booths at Pride Fest yesterday, and many pastors participating, sharing God's love with a community that needed healing. For all the pastors and all the churches and all church members that have treated that community like the synagogue leader treated the bent-over woman, here was a contingent of churches telling them that yes, they do matter. Yes, they are loved just as they are, and yes, they are worthy children of God. The leader of the synagogue in our gospel lesson was not happy with Jesus. Jesus put God's law above the laws of humanity, and that could not be. There are rules for a reason, he would argue, and Jesus is violating the rules, breaking the law. Is this to be allowed? Our Old Testament lesson is the call of another lawbreaker, Jeremiah. Jeremiah was one of the boldest prophets of Israel, living 700 years before Jesus. In our call story today, we hear God speaking to Jeremiah, telling him that God consecrated him even before he was born. Consecrated, even before he was born. What does that mean? The word consecrated comes from the same root word as sacrament and sacred. They all have to do with setting someone apart for a particular purpose. So Jeremiah was set apart for a particular purpose even before he was born. God tells him to be a prophet to the nations. Now, contrary to popular belief, being a prophet doesn't have anything to do with predicting the future, at least in the biblical sense. Prophets don't predict the future, they boldly tell the present as it is. A prophet is not a fortune teller. A prophet is someone who speaks the truth to power, even when it is difficult or dangerous to do so. Jeremiah was consecrated by God, set apart by God to speak the truth to power, even when it was difficult or dangerous to do so. And then Jeremiah doubts his ability to do this. He said, "But God, I'm only a child. I don't know how to do this task." But God lifts him up, affirming his dignity and worth. God says, "Do not be afraid and do not diminish yourself. I will be with you. I have reached out my hand to you and blessed you and appointed you to speak the truth, to pluck up and pull down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant." consecrated to God. Jeremiah lived into this, speaking boldly about justice. And now we are the heirs of Jeremiah, called by God as Columbia United Church of Christ and as individuals within that church, members of it. Like Jeremiah, we are consecrated by God to be agents of change in the world. We are consecrated by God to speak the truth and to lift up those who are marginalized in our society. Like Jeremiah, we are consecrated by God to be on a mission of justice, and that is not always easy in our world. But as inheritors of the gospel of Jesus, it is our call, and we are consecrated to it. So who is the bent-over woman in your world? Who has been maligned by the privilege in our society and needs affirmation? You don't need to go to a festival, or march in a parade, or protest, or anything like that to be prophetic. There are ways every day we can stand up to those who are disenfranchised. Look at the world through Jesus' eyes, and you too can change someone's life for the better. You can be an agent of change. You can bring new life to the bent-over woman. Don't say, "Oh God, truly I don't know how to speak, for I am only a child." God's words are in your mouth, and you are consecrated to God. Amen.